In the early decades of the 20th century, the Jewish people wandered across the continents like a river searching for the sea, carrying with them centuries of stories, prayers, and sorrow. Europe was both home and prison, a place where communities had thrived for generations, yet the shadow of persecution never fully lifted. In cities like Warsaw, Vilnius, and Budapest, bustling Jewish neighborhoods hummed with life, markets overflowed with spices and bread, children played in narrow alleyways, and synagogues stood tall with voices raised in prayer. But behind the laughter and the music lurked a dark reality. Pogroms, systemic discrimination, and centuries of exile had ingrained a sense of vulnerability deep into the Jewish consciousness. Each generation passed down not only traditions and faith but also the memory of pain, of the precariousness of their existence in a world that often refused to welcome them. By the late 19th century, a small but determined movement had begun to take shape: Zionism. It was born from the vision of Theodor Herzl and others who dared to imagine a homeland where Jews could govern themselves, practice their religion freely, and live without fear. They envisioned Palestine, a land both ancient and sacred, as the destination for this dream. Yet, the world was not yet ready. The Ottoman Empire controlled the territory, and the indigenous Arab population had their own lives, villages, and attachments. Early waves of Jewish immigrants arrived quietly, purchasing land, farming the soil, and establishing communities. They faced not only the natural hardships of a new land but also tensions with Arabs, who viewed the newcomers with suspicion and fear, seeing their own futures threatened by these outsiders with foreign ambitions. When World War I erupted, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain assumed control of Palestine under the League of Nations mandate. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, ignited hope among Jews across Europe. It was a promise, a beacon of possibility after centuries of wandering. But with hope came tension. Arab communities, who constituted the majority population, felt betrayed, their aspirations for self-determination ignored by imperial powers. Riots broke out intermittently in the 1920s and 1930s, blood spilled in cities and villages, and both communities hardened their positions. What had started as a dream of sanctuary slowly became a powder keg of competing claims and clashing identities. Meanwhile, the Jews of Europe faced mounting hostility. In Germany, anti-Semitism grew into a virulent ideology, culminating in the rise of the Nazis. Other European nations were not free from prejudice, and pogroms persisted in Eastern Europe. Jewish life became increasingly precarious, prompting migration to Palestine to accelerate. But the British, fearing political unrest and wanting to maintain control, imposed strict limits on immigration, issuing only a fraction of the necessary permits. This forced many to undertake illegal journeys, crossing the Mediterranean on overcrowded, unseaworthy ships, hoping to evade naval patrols. Each arrival was a risk, each landing a defiance of international law, yet the determination to reach a land that might finally feel like home outweighed the dangers. As the 1930s advanced, the storm of war approached. Jews across Europe sensed the gathering darkness even before the world recognized it. Families sent children to distant countries for safety, communities prepared for flight, and underground networks organized migration routes. The very act of survival became intertwined with migration. Each person who made the journey to Palestine carried not only their belongings but also the memories of those they had lost, the weight of generations that had endured persecution, and the hope that perhaps, finally, a home could be built from the ruins of the past. In Palestine, Jewish immigrants faced another challenge: survival itself. Settlers drained swamps, battled diseases like malaria, built homes from stone and mud, and labored under the sun to transform a harsh and rugged landscape into fields, orchards, and cities. This physical labor mirrored the emotional labor of establishing identity and community amidst tension and hostility. Arab resistance to Jewish settlement was not merely a political obstacle, it was a deeply human response to a disruption in lives and landscapes long established. Clashes erupted sporadically, sometimes escalating into full-scale violence. Yet, for the immigrants, each hardship strengthened resolve. The promise of a homeland, however distant and fraught, was a light they refused to extinguish. By the late 1930s, the shadow of global conflict loomed over Palestine as it did over all of Europe. The Jewish population had grown steadily, and the infrastructure of towns and kibbutzim reflected their determination to stay. But the world beyond watched largely in silence, preoccupied with its own political crises and underestimating the urgency of the Jewish plight. Meanwhile, within Europe, persecution intensified. Laws restricted every facet of Jewish life, eroding the ability to work, study, and live freely. Anti-Semitism was no longer a social inconvenience, it was systematic, calculated, and lethal. Families who had once debated whether to emigrate now faced stark reality, their choice was between peril and a chance at survival elsewhere. Thus, the stage was set for a massive shift, one that would define the Jewish experience forever. The stage was not only the physical land of Palestine but the moral and political battlefield of the world, where centuries of exile and suffering intersected with emerging global powers. Jews across Europe and the Middle East felt the urgency more acutely with each passing year. They were no longer merely immigrants seeking opportunity, they were refugees seeking existence, fleeing a continent descending into hatred and violence. In Palestine, communities braced for the challenges ahead, aware that the establishment of a Jewish state would not come easily, and yet determined to see the dream through. In the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and countless smaller settlements, life continued with quiet intensity. Children went to schools where Hebrew was being revived as a spoken language, markets overflowed with produce, synagogues rang with prayers that carried both hope and lamentation. Every new house built, every farm tilled, every school opened was an assertion of presence and identity. The Jewish people were not only surviving, they were preparing for a moment when the world might finally recognize their claim, not only to a land but to dignity, security, and self-determination. And so, by 1940, as the shadow of World War II darkened the globe, the Jewish population in Palestine had grown into a determined, resilient community. It was a population forged in the crucible of exile and persecution, tempered by labor, vision, and the unyielding hope for a homeland. The world had yet to witness the full magnitude of suffering and courage that would soon follow, nor the extraordinary journey that would bring millions to this small patch of land, forever altering the history of nations. Yet in the quiet streets and bustling settlements, in the dreams of children and the prayers of elders, the first faint outlines of a homeland were emerging, a promise that would soon be tested in fire, blood, and the triumph of survival. Holocaust and the urgency for a state. By the time the world plunged into the chaos of World War II, the Jewish population in Europe already bore deep scars from centuries of persecution. Communities that had once thrived were vulnerable, and whispers of Zionism had spread among those desperate for safety. But nothing could prepare the Jewish people for the horrors that awaited them. The Holocaust was unlike any tragedy in human history, systematic, industrialized, and merciless. Entire families vanished overnight, villages emptied, and cities that had hummed with life fell silent. The Nazis' meticulously planned genocide turned Europe into a continent of fear, loss, and grief. For those who survived, liberation came as both relief and shock, a recognition of what had been endured and a haunting awareness of what had been lost forever. Amid this devastation, survivors found themselves in displaced persons (DP) camps scattered across Germany, Austria, and Italy. These camps were overcrowded, under-resourced, and temporary, but they became a space where people tried to reclaim fragments of their former lives. Children learned to read again, makeshift schools were established, and survivors clung to their faith and culture as a lifeline. Yet beneath the surface, a profound question gnawed at them: where could they go? Returning to pre-war homes was impossible. Many were destroyed, appropriated, or hostile to Jewish returnees. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by strangers or ruins. Europe, once the heart of Jewish life, had become a graveyard of memories. It was in this bleak environment that the urgency for a Jewish state became undeniable. Refugees were desperate to escape Europe, but immigration quotas and restrictive policies across the globe hindered them. The United States, still recovering from the Great Depression and wary of overpopulation, offered limited refuge. Britain controlled access to Palestine and, despite the Balfour Declaration, imposed strict immigration limits. Zionist organizations, recognizing the life-or-death stakes, intensified their efforts, orchestrating clandestine operations to smuggle Jews across the Mediterranean in crowded ships. Each journey was perilous. Many were intercepted, detained in detention camps in Cyprus, or forced back. Yet the determination to reach Palestine never waned. For survivors, it was no longer merely a dream, it was a lifeline, the difference between despair and hope. The war also sparked unprecedented international attention to the Jewish plight. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps and documented the atrocities, the world could no longer ignore the scale of the Holocaust. Newspapers reported the horrors in graphic detail, and photographs of emaciated survivors shocked public opinion. Political leaders faced pressure to act, and the urgency of providing a homeland for the Jewish people became a moral imperative. The idea that Jews needed a sovereign state, not merely charity or temporary refuge, gained traction. The failures of nations to prevent or halt the genocide underscored that safety and security could only be guaranteed through self-determination. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the Jewish community, already strengthened by earlier waves of immigration, prepared for an influx of survivors. New settlements, kibbutzim, and urban centers were expanded to accommodate the growing population. Schools and hospitals were established, and local governance structures were adapted to meet the pressing needs of immigrants. The demographic landscape of Palestine was transforming rapidly. With each new arrival, the Jewish population became more diverse, including Jews from Poland, Hungary, Romania, and other parts of Europe. Each group brought unique languages, traditions, and experiences, enriching the community but also presenting challenges of integration. Yet the shared trauma of displacement and the shared vision of a homeland united them. The years 1945 to 1947 were critical. Thousands of Jews, liberated from death camps, walked across Europe with nothing but hope, memories, and the clothes on their backs. Displaced persons camps became hubs of political activity, as survivors debated the future and organized efforts to reach Palestine. Zionist youth groups trained volunteers in skills ranging from agriculture to defense, anticipating the difficult journey ahead. Secret immigration networks coordinated ships, routes, and forged documents, often at great personal risk. These efforts were acts of courage and defiance, a declaration that despite unimaginable suffering, the Jewish people would not vanish. However, the British authorities, attempting to maintain order and appease both Arab and Jewish populations, continued to enforce immigration limits. Tensions escalated, leading to confrontations at sea and on land. Ships carrying refugees were intercepted, and in some cases, passengers were sent back to Europe, often into uncertainty and continued danger. The struggle for immigration rights became both a political and humanitarian battle, drawing attention from the global community. Each ship that succeeded was celebrated not only for saving lives but also for affirming the principle that a Jewish homeland was no longer optional, it was essential. The Holocaust left an indelible mark not only on individuals but on the collective psyche of the Jewish people. The scale of loss created a profound urgency, reinforcing the necessity of statehood. Survivors understood that their survival alone was not enough. They needed security, sovereignty, and a place where they could rebuild their lives free from persecution. This urgency was shared by Zionist leaders, who lobbied the United Nations and international powers to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state. The convergence of moral responsibility, political pragmatism, and historical necessity set the stage for decisive action in the years to come. By 1947, Europe was scarred but slowly recovering, and the Jewish community had become increasingly vocal and organized. The plight of Holocaust survivors had captured global attention, and the conversation was no longer about charity, it was about justice and national rights. The United Nations, recognizing the complexities of the region and the moral imperatives involved, proposed a partition plan to establish separate Jewish and Arab states. For Jews, this represented a glimmer of hope, a tangible path to self-determination. For survivors, it was the culmination of years of struggle, persecution, and displacement. Even before the UN's official decisions, the migration of Jews to Palestine accelerated. Ships arrived in ports, sometimes in defiance of authorities, carrying men, women, and children who had endured horrors beyond imagination. Each step on Palestinian soil was a statement of survival, resilience, and determination. Communities rallied to welcome the newcomers, providing food, shelter, and work. These acts were not just charitable, they were foundational, shaping the infrastructure and society of a future state. The mosaic of cultures, languages, and histories began to merge into a single, shared narrative, the creation of a homeland born from suffering, hope, and unyielding will. By the close of 1947, the stage was set. The Holocaust had devastated Europe, displaced millions, and underscored the necessity of a Jewish homeland. Zionist leaders were ready, survivors were arriving, and the international community faced the challenge of balancing competing claims. The urgency for statehood had never been clearer, fueled not only by tragedy but by determination. For the Jewish people, the next chapter promised both peril and possibility, a confrontation with history itself as they prepared to claim a homeland against the odds. Birth of Israel and the 1948 War. The night of May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv was charged with a mix of jubilation and tension, a city holding its breath at the cusp of history. After decades of exile, persecution, and relentless struggle, the Jewish people were finally on the verge of realizing a centuries-old dream, sovereignty over a homeland of their own. David Ben-Gurion, standing before a gathering of leaders and citizens, read aloud the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. It was more than words on paper, it was an affirmation of survival, a statement of identity, and a claim to a future shaped by Jews themselves, not by empires or oppressors. The declaration echoed through the streets, as sirens wailed, prayers were whispered in synagogues, and flags bearing the Star of David were raised across settlements. Yet even as the celebrations began, shadows loomed on the horizon. The Arab states Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon reacted almost immediately, unwilling to recognize the legitimacy of the new state. For them, the creation of Israel was a betrayal, a colonial imposition on land they considered theirs. Armies mobilized, borders hardened, and the fragile air of celebration gave way to the grim reality of war. This was not a conflict born of ideology alone, it was a struggle over identity, territory, and the right to exist. Both sides were prepared to fight fiercely, knowing that the outcome would determine the fate of generations. The fighting began almost instantly. Cities, towns, and villages became battlegrounds. The nascent Israel Defense Forces, still in formation and composed of immigrants from diverse backgrounds, faced a daunting task: defend a new state with limited resources, training, and equipment against multiple invading armies. Despite these challenges, their resolve was unshakable. Each skirmish, each firefight, became not only a military engagement but a symbol of the determination of a people who had survived the Holocaust, persecution, and displacement, now willing to fight for the very soil they had longed for. Meanwhile, the civilian population endured hardship beyond imagination. Thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled their homes, some in anticipation of violence, others forcibly displaced during the fighting. Entire communities vanished overnight, leaving behind abandoned houses, orchards, and memories etched into the land. Simultaneously, Jews in Arab-majority areas faced attacks, leading to a reverse wave of displacement. The conflict was as much about survival as it was about sovereignty. Refugees crowded temporary shelters, and families struggled to secure food, water, and medical care amid the chaos of war. The human cost was immense, and the emotional toll weighed heavily on both sides. Despite overwhelming odds, Israel managed to consolidate its positions through strategic planning, international support, and sheer perseverance. Volunteers, many of them Holocaust survivors, contributed not only manpower but also an indomitable spirit. Arms were smuggled into the country through clandestine operations, engineers repaired roads, and medical teams tended to the wounded. Every victory, no matter how small, was celebrated as a testament to resilience. It was clear that this was more than a military struggle, it was a fight for identity, legitimacy, and the right to continue as a people after centuries of adversity. The war saw a complex interplay of conventional battles and guerrilla tactics. In some areas, small units of Israeli fighters outmaneuvered larger Arab forces, using knowledge of the terrain and surprise to their advantage. In others, cities endured prolonged sieges, with civilians caught in crossfire, rationing supplies, and hiding from artillery fire. Reports of heroism and tragedy circulated, each story adding to the collective narrative of a nation in the making. International observers watched closely, with some supporting Israel's claims to self-determination, while others criticized the displacement of Palestinians, highlighting the moral complexity of the conflict. By early 1949, the armistice agreements began to take shape, ending the immediate fighting and drawing borders that would define Israel's territory. These agreements did not resolve all disputes, nor did they erase the scars left by months of warfare. Cities lay partially destroyed, infrastructure was damaged, and both Jewish and Arab communities had to reckon with loss on an unprecedented scale. Yet Israel had survived its first existential test, proving that a new state could withstand both internal challenges and external aggression. For the Jewish people, the victory was monumental, though bittersweet. It secured their sovereignty but left unresolved the plight of displaced Palestinians and ongoing regional tensions. During this period, Jewish immigration accelerated dramatically. Holocaust survivors, once confined to European DP camps, streamed into Israel, many under organized operations like Aliyah Bet, the clandestine migration network. These arrivals transformed the demographic landscape of the country almost overnight. Cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem swelled with new residents, necessitating rapid construction of housing, schools, and healthcare facilities. The challenge was immense: feeding, sheltering, and integrating hundreds of thousands of refugees into a nation barely equipped for survival. Yet the determination to build a homeland overcame scarcity, hardship, and exhaustion. Laborers drained swamps, built roads, and cultivated fields, turning a small state into a functioning society almost immediately. Social cohesion, however, was not without struggle. The immigrants brought with them diverse languages, religious practices, and cultural traditions. Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, Sephardic Jews from North Africa, and Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East had to navigate differences while uniting under the shared goal of national survival. Institutions were rapidly established to bridge these divides, from schools teaching Hebrew to communal programs fostering integration. Military service further bonded citizens, creating a sense of unity forged through shared sacrifice. Israel was becoming more than a collection of immigrants; it was emerging as a nation, defined by resilience, determination, and a vision for the future. The 1948 war left deep and lasting effects on the region. It created a precedent for ongoing conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, with unresolved territorial disputes and refugee crises fueling decades of tension. It also demonstrated the strategic and moral imperatives of nationhood. Survival required both military capability and international recognition. For Israel, the war cemented a national identity forged in adversity, with narratives of courage, sacrifice, and survival deeply embedded in collective memory. The war's legacy would shape Israeli politics, society, and foreign relations for generations, influencing policies on defense, immigration, and state building. As the dust settled, Israel's citizens reflected on a remarkable yet sobering reality: they had achieved statehood, a homeland, and a measure of security, but the journey was only beginning. Borders had been drawn, but the future remained uncertain. Refugees needed homes, cities needed rebuilding, and a diverse population needed unity. Yet in every settlement, every kibbutz, and every urban street, there was a palpable sense of purpose. The Jewish people, having endured centuries of exile, persecution, and unimaginable loss, were finally writing their own history on their own land, determined to ensure that the dream of a homeland would endure against all odds. Migration, integration, and legacy. The war had ended, but Israel was just beginning. The streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem buzzed with the energy of survivors, immigrants, and pioneers, each carrying stories of despair, hope, and endurance. The air was filled with the scent of construction dust, fresh bread, and burning wood from makeshift stoves. The country's population was swelling at an unprecedented rate. Jews from Europe, traumatized yet determined, joined by those fleeing persecution in Arab lands, arrived in waves. For many, the new state was not merely a destination, it was salvation, a refuge from the shadows of the Holocaust and the hostility of neighboring countries. Each newcomer brought with them skills, culture, and a history that would shape the emerging society in ways both challenging and transformative. Housing was the first and most pressing problem. Cities, already strained by wartime damage, were overwhelmed. Makeshift settlements, tent cities, and repurposed buildings became temporary homes for thousands. In some areas, the military had to coordinate rationing of food, water, and electricity to ensure survival. Every day was a struggle to balance basic needs with the vision of nation building. Yet amid the chaos, communities formed bonds. Neighbors shared resources, organized communal kitchens, and created schools for children who had never known stability. For many immigrants, the hardships of the present were a small price to pay for the safety and promise of a homeland where they could live freely. Agriculture became the backbone of the country's survival and growth. Kibbutzim and moshavim, collective and cooperative settlements, expanded rapidly, transforming arid land into productive fields. European immigrants introduced modern farming techniques, while Jews from Arab lands brought knowledge of local crops and irrigation methods. The combined expertise turned deserts into orchards, barren hills into wheat fields, and empty plots into vegetable gardens. Work in the fields was grueling, but it was also a form of empowerment. Building the land physically mirrored the construction of a new identity. Agriculture not only provided food but also became a symbol of resilience and self-sufficiency, demonstrating that Israel could survive and thrive despite external hostility. The integration of diverse Jewish communities was another monumental challenge. Ashkenazi Jews from Europe often had different educational backgrounds, languages, and cultural norms compared to Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and the Middle East. Yet the shared experience of displacement, persecution, and hope for a homeland created a unifying thread. Schools, civic organizations, and youth movements played a pivotal role in bridging cultural divides. Hebrew became the common language, taught not only in classrooms but also in homes, workplaces, and social gatherings. Festivals, music, and theater celebrated both the diversity and unity of the population, blending traditions into a cohesive national culture. Over time, these efforts helped forge a shared identity, Israeli, yet enriched by the global Jewish diaspora. Economic development was essential for stability. Factories, ports, and transportation networks were rapidly constructed, often under severe resource constraints. International aid, donations from Jewish communities abroad, and remittances from family members helped sustain the economy. Labor was mobilized in every possible way. Men and women worked in construction, agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce, often enduring grueling hours in harsh conditions. Despite shortages of machinery and materials, ingenuity flourished. Refugees and immigrants repurposed abandoned equipment, learned new trades, and adapted to unfamiliar climates and technologies. Every challenge overcame became a lesson in resilience, shaping a society capable of innovation and endurance. Security remained a constant concern. Though the 1948 war had ended, hostilities with neighboring Arab states persisted. Border skirmishes, infiltrations, and sabotage attempts were frequent. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, initially composed of hastily trained volunteers, evolved into a disciplined and organized military, capable of defending the state while coordinating internal security. Civilians, too, participated in defense, forming local militias and volunteer brigades. The shared sense of danger reinforced community bonds and underscored the precariousness of statehood. Every citizen, whether soldier, laborer, or teacher, was part of the effort to ensure that the sacrifices of the past had not been in vain. Education became a cornerstone of nation building. Schools were established across cities and settlements, providing children with literacy, vocational skills, and knowledge of history and culture. Universities expanded rapidly, attracting both local and international scholars. The curriculum emphasized the revival of Hebrew, the history of the Jewish people, and the values of democracy and civic responsibility. This investment in education was not merely academic, it was strategic. By empowering the next generation, Israel ensured that its citizens would be capable of sustaining the state economically, politically, and socially. Education became a means of transforming trauma into opportunity, equipping young Israelis to contribute to a society born of survival and vision. Culturally, the country thrived. Literature, music, theater, and visual arts blossomed as immigrants shared their traditions while experimenting with new forms of expression. Writers chronicled the stories of displacement, survival, and hope. Musicians blended European melodies with Middle Eastern rhythms. Artists painted scenes of reconstruction, battlefields, and everyday life, capturing both tragedy and triumph. These cultural expressions were more than entertainment, they were acts of remembrance and identity building. They preserved memory, celebrated resilience, and created a narrative that reinforced national unity while honoring diverse backgrounds. The legacy of these formative years shaped not only Israel's internal structure but also its role on the global stage. The country became a symbol of Jewish self-determination, a testament to survival and perseverance in the face of unimaginable adversity. Internationally, Israel navigated diplomatic challenges, seeking recognition and aid while managing tensions with neighboring states. Domestically, it built institutions, established governance, and nurtured a vibrant civil society. Each success, from harvest yields to educational achievements, reinforced the narrative that a homeland created through struggle could endure, adapt, and flourish. By the mid-1950s, Israel had transformed from a fledgling state into a dynamic, resilient nation. Immigrants continued to arrive, refugees found homes, and cities expanded. Yet the lessons of the past remained central to collective consciousness. The Holocaust, the 1948 war, and the struggles of migration were never forgotten. They were woven into the identity of a people determined to ensure that history's horrors would not repeat. The nation that emerged was not perfect, but it was alive, vibrant, and unyielding. Israel became more than a geographical entity, it became a living testament to survival, resilience, and the enduring power of hope.